Hey everyone, so I've been through all the Group 3 cars in Gran Turismo 7. A lot of them are really nice to drive, but some of them not so much. If you consider yourself a beginner or you prefer a more stable driving experience, then this is the video for you, because in this video we're going to be going through a few cars that you should probably avoid because they can be quite a pain to drive. It's not to say that these cars are not competitive, because some of them are really good. It's just that they are quite tricky to drive and it requires some good driving skill. And just before we get into it, if you're from New Zealand and you want to pick up some new sim racing gear, like a new wheel, new pedals, anything like that, or even some new gaming equipment, then be sure to head over to NZ Gaming. I've got their link in the description of this video. All the sim racing gear that I'm going to be using in this video, including the wheel, the wheelbase and the pedals, have kindly been provided by NZ Gaming, so thanks to them. Be sure to go check them out if you're from NZ. Right, so the first thing worth mentioning is generally in GT cars, the cars with the engine behind the driver's seat are generally going to be more difficult to drive. Because when you're entering turns, the weight from the rear end likes to pull itself around and sort of puts you into a bit of a spin sometimes. So my quick tip here is if you're not too sure where the engine is in the car, then be sure to look at the car's information. As we see at the top left here, next to drivetrain, we have MR. That means we have a mid-engine car. The engine is behind the driver's seat. And then we might have a rear engine car, which would be RR. That means the engine is sitting over the rear axle. So generally these kind of cars are going to be more difficult to drive. Not all of them. There's a few cars that I won't mention here today because they're actually quite stable, but we're going to go through some that might give you some troubles. So throughout this video, all the cars that we're going to be talking about have similar issues, so I'm not going to be repeating myself all the time. We're just going to explain the issues here at the start, and then we're going to take a look at the cars that kind of suffer from it. As you can already see on screen, we can see the issues we might be having, and that would be more of the entry oversteer kind of thing. So we've got the Audi R8 LMS here, which is the 2015 Audi R8. On corner entry, these cars have a tendency to have an entry oversteer, which can cost you a lot of time. If you're not too confident with your driving skills, then entering turns too quickly or too aggressively can lead you to put the car sideways in corner entry and lose yourself tons of time. So if you struggle with this, a front engine, more stable car would probably be suited to you, because right here, that's just cost me a whole bunch of time, that big slide there. Whereas if you backed off a little earlier and a more front engine car, you could just lift off the throttle and you have a lot more stability. So this is one of the cars I would suggest you avoid if you struggle with the car keeping it steady. There's a couple other difficulties worth mentioning with these cars, and one would be the behavior over bumps and big curbs. As you'll see right here, these mid-engine cars have a tendency to get a bit shaky and loose when you go over these bumps and curbs. And the other thing that's definitely worth mentioning that I really hate a lot is driving hairpins with these mid-engine cars. They have this thing which I like to call mid-engine snap. So when you go into a really tight turn and you put a lot of steering lock onto the car, like right here, the car enters this uncontrollable slide that puts you into a 180 spin. So to avoid this, you either have to hold a little bit of throttle input into the turn that kind of stabilizes the rear end, or you just have to be extra careful with your steering input. You can't turn too much. And another thing is obviously not to carry too much speed into the turn. It's probably my biggest issue with these mid-engine cars on Gran Turismo 7. A lot of them have this driving characteristic. It is very difficult to control, so if you can't get around it, then stick away from these cars. The next car on our list here being the Audi R8 LMS Evo. The next car that we have on this list would be the Lamborghini Huracan GT3. It handles fairly similar to those Audis, however it seems a little bit more on edge than those cars did. It also suffers quite heavily from that mid-engine snap on the hairpins, and it also struggles quite a lot in those mid to high speed turns with that entry oversteer. It's not too difficult to catch, it's definitely catchable, but it is quite a difficult car to drive. The next car on this list will be the Alfa Romeo 4C Group 3 car. Now this car is a little different to those previous few cars I mentioned. This thing snaps a lot more suddenly and harder than those other cars did. The Audi and the Lambo, they both have a more gradual float into the turns. However, with this thing, it's a bit more understeery, and then if you just lift off the throttle too quickly, it'll snap very quickly, as you might see here. It's kind of difficult to see from this view, but it does happen quite quickly. Its issues are mostly the same, they just happen in a little bit of a different way. Another car that might cause some issues for you would be the 4GT race car, which is what we have right in front of us here. Now, this car, similar to the Alfa, is quite snappy. It's more of a sudden snap compared to the Audi and the Lambo, something in between those two and the Alfa. This car really does seem to struggle with bumps and curbs though. So as we come into that final chicane at Spa, we're using all the curbs on the inside here, which we can do with a lot of cars, but with this car, especially with that last curb, we hit the bump and it flicks us into a mid-engine snap. This car really does require good control, particularly on the throttle and turn entry. You don't want to just drop the throttle or you end up in a bit of a slide. Now here we have the Citroen GT race car. This thing's a little bit closer to the Audi and the Lambos. It has a bit more of a slower gradual entry controllable slide there, and it has a little bit of that mid-engine snap on tight hairpins. but it's a bit more controllable than some of the other cars. It mostly has a bit of mid-speed turn kind of oversteer. And another issue that some of these cars have in some braking zones, like this one here, it's a bit of a curved, cambered, downhill braking zone, is that when you brake hard, they kind of enter a bit of a slide in the braking zone, which you got to be prepared to control. Gets a bit of out of hand sometimes, like it did there. And it's also a car that doesn't really like curbs all that much. These curbs aren't that huge, and we get a bit of entry oversteer here, and then as we come over the curb, it just undersettles the car further, and that just creates a chain effect which puts us into a slide. Now we have the Honda NSX Group 3 car, which has a bit more of a sudden kind of snap. To be honest, this is one of the better cars out of the list we have here today. But as you can see, it's just as we come off the throttle, the car snaps out on us, and we get that in most of these mid-speed turns. Now the Renault RS01, this car is actually very difficult to drive. I think a lot of people struggle with this one. It can be really good to drive, but it requires a very precise driving style, because if you get it wrong, as you see, if you carry too much speed into a turn, drop the throttle too quickly like the other cars, you end up sideways. So it's definitely more of a car for advanced drivers, but not too bad of a car overall. Now the Peugeot RCZ isn't actually too bad. It's mostly a fairly stable car, but sometimes when we suddenly pick up a lot of front grip, like when we hit a compression, for example here at Bathurst, when we come down the S's here, when we get to the dipper, we'll see an example where we suddenly get a bunch of front grip, it pulls the front end and then the rear end can't keep up and it flicks out like right there, and then into the wall we go. It's mostly a stable car, but just be careful with it, it might catch you out in a few scenarios. Getting closer towards the end of this list, we have the McLaren F1 GTR, and I personally really like the way this car drives, but it's not always the most stable thing. In the mid to high speed turns it can get a little bit loose, and when it starts penduluming left and right like that, it's kind of difficult to catch and might lead you into a bit of a spin. The car can be quite difficult to drive on a track like Spa, which is a track filled with mid to high speed turns, and the car likes to float through those turns, so if you can control it and balance your throttle, it's really quick, but you might struggle with it if you're not used to your car control. And again, like right here, if you suddenly drop off the throttle when going through a turn, it's going to snap on you, again throwing you into a spin. Now for our final car on the list, which will be the test spec version of the Ford GTLM, which is quite an unstable thing. It's quite snappy, similar to the other Ford GT. It's got a lot of that mid-engine snap, which we get in the tighter turns, and also entering a mid to high speed turn, lifting off the throttle too quickly will quite easily put you into a bit of a slide and cost you lots of time. And then here again, we're just looking at a tight turn, the car snaps out a wee bit. Then coming into the next tight turn, we're going to take another look at that, look at the way we enter the apex and the car just snaps out on us. We have to do a lot of correcting and it costs us a huge amount of time. And I'm not going to include the other Ford GTM, the white race spec version of the car, because that one's actually a dream to drive. I didn't have too many stability issues with that one. It was more so the black test car. And another mention I might make is the Ferrari 458 GT3 car. That one's not too bad, but it can catch you out in a couple of the tight turns maybe sometimes, so just be aware of that one. Otherwise, if you're looking for a nice stable car to drive, look for the cars labelled as FR, front engine cars. They're generally going to be more stable and a lot easier for you to get used to than these mid-engine cars. And if you guys have any of your own tips, feel free to leave them in the comments. And if you guys want to keep up to date with any sim racing news, content, updates, blog posts and more, and be sure to check out simrace247.com. I know a lot of people already know this kind of stuff, but I know there's a lot of people who don't, so I hope this might have helped some of you out. Thank you all for watching and catch you very soon.